Half Magic by Edward Eagar. We're continuing with the fourth chapter, which is called What Happened to Katherine. "I can't get used to this being rushed around," complained Martha a second later as she found herself somewhere else for the third time in 3 minutes. "Where are we now, and when is it?" "Camelot, I should think," said Katherine. "In tournament time, look." Jane and Mark and Martha looked. Camelot and the field of tournament looked exactly as you would all expect them to look. Camelot and the field of tournament looked exactly as you all would expect them to look from the descriptions in The Boys King Arthur and the wonderful books of Mr. T.H. White. Trumpets were blowing clarion calls, and pennons fluttered in the blue air, and armor flashed in the bright light, and gallant knights and trusty squires and faithful pages and ladies fair and lowly varlets were crowding into the stands in hundreds to watch the chivalrous sport. The 4 children had front row grandstand seats, for Katherine had made that part of her wish. She had forgotten to say anything in her wish about getting rid of the 4 horses, and at first these made some trouble by wanting to sit in the grandstand too, much to the annoyance of the people sitting behind, but Katherine wished them twice as far away, and they disappeared. At this, the people behind got up and left in a hurry, looking back at the 4 children and muttering about witchcraft and sorcery. The children paid small heed. They were too busy looking around them and drinking in the sights. King Arthur sat enthroned on a high platform at one end of the field. The children could see him clearly, with his kind, simple, understanding face, like the warm sun come to shine on merry England. Queen Guinevere was seated at his right, and Merlin, the magician, thin and wise and grey-bearded, at his left. And now the trumpets blew an extra long fanfare, and the tournament began. Sir Lancelot was among the first to ride out on the field. The children recognized him by his armor. "I told you he'd come out all right," said Katherine a bit bitterly. But when Sir Lancelot got going in the tournament, even Katherine had to admire him. He smote down 5 knights with his first spear, and 4 knights with his second spear, and unhorsed 3 more with his sword, until all the people sitting round on the benches began crying out, "Oh, gramercy! What marvellous deeds that knight doth do in that there field." Jane sighed a satisfied sigh. "Kind of glorious, isn't it?" she murmured. "It's the most wonderful age in human history," said Mark solemnly. "If only it didn't have to end." "Why did it?" asked Martha, who hadn't read The Boys King Arthur yet. "Partly because some of the other knights got tired of being knocked down all the time and having Lancelot always win," Mark told her. "Yes," said Katherine in a rather peculiar way. "It would really be a good deed in a way if somebody knocked him down for a change, wouldn't it?" Mark gave her a sharp look, but just then Sir Lancelot started knocking down more knights, and he had to watch the field. When he looked again, Katherine wasn't there. Mark nudged Jane hard as a horrible thought came into his mind. Jane turned and saw the empty spot where Katherine had been, and Mark could tell that she was having the same thought too. Just then there was an interruption in the tournament. A strange knight rode out on the field of combat, and straight up to King Arthur's platform. "I crave your majesty's permission to challenge Sir Lancelot in single combat," cried the strange knight, in a voice loud enough for the children to hear clearly from where they sat. The hearts of Jane and Mark sank. Even Martha now guessed the horrid truth. "How dare she?" she whispered. "I don't know," said Mark. "She's been getting too full of herself ever since we started this wish." "Wait till I get her home," said Jane grimly. "How call they you, strange knight?" King Arthur was saying meanwhile. "And whence do you hail?" "They call me Sir Cath," said the strange knight, "and I hail from Toledo, Ohio." "I know not this Toledo," said King Arthur, "but fight if you will. Let the combat begin." The trumpets sounded another clarion call. The strange knight faced Sir Lancelot, and there began the strangest combat, it is safe to say, ever witnessed by the Knights of the Round Table, or any other table. The intrepid Katherine thought herself very clever at this moment. She had wished she were wearing 2 suits of armor and riding 2 horses, and she had wished that she were 2.5 times as tall and as strong as Sir Lancelot, and she wished that she would defeat him twice, And immediately here she was, wearing one suit of armor and riding one horse, and she was 1.25 times as tall and strong, and she couldn't wait to defeat him once. But in her cleverness she had forgotten one thing. She had forgotten to wish that she knew the rules of jousting, and here she was, facing the greatest knight in the world, and she didn't know how to start. She knew she'd win in the end, because she'd wished it that way, but what was she to do in the beginning and middle? Before she could work out another wish to take care of this, Sir Launcelot rode at her, struck her with his lance, and knocked her back onto her horse's tail. Then he rode at her from the opposite direction and knocked her forward onto her horse's neck. The crowd roared with laughter. The feelings of Jane, Mark, and Martha may well be imagined. As for the feelings of Katherine, they knew no bounds. She still held the magic charm clutched in one hot hand, and she wasn't bothering about correct arithmetic now. "I wish I could fight 10 times as well as you bully! Yah!" were the words that the valiant Sir Cath spoke upon the field. It was a cry of pure temper, and immediately she could fight 5 times as well as Sir Launcelot, and everyone knows how good he was. What followed would have to be seen to be believed. Katherine came down like several wolves on the fold. She seemed to spring from all sides at once. Her sword flashed like a living thunderbolt. Her lance whipped about, now here, now there, like a snake gone mad. "Zounds!" cried the people, and "Lack-a-day!" and "Wurra, wurra!" Jane, Mark, and Martha watched with clasped hands. If Sir Launcelot had not been the greatest knight in the world, he would never have lived to tell the tale. Even as it was, the end was swift. In something less than a thrice, he was unseated from his horse, fell to the ground with a crash, and did not rise again. Katherine galloped round and round the field, bowing graciously to the applause of the crowd. But she soon noticed that the crowd wasn't applauding very loudly, and it was only the traitorous knights like Sir Mordred and Sir Agravain, the ones who were jealous of Launcelot, who were applauding at all. The rest of the crowd was strangely silent, for Launcelot, the flower of knighthood, the darling of the people's hearts, the greatest champion of the Round Table, had been defeated. Queen Guinevere looked furious, King Arthur looked sad, the attendant knights, except for the traitorous ones, looked absolutely wretched. Merlin looked as if he didn't believe it. Jane and Mark and Martha looked as though they believed it, but didn't want to. And it was then that the full knowledge of what she had done swept over Katherine. She had succeeded and she had failed. She, a mere girl, had defeated the greatest knight in history, but she had pretended to herself that she was doing it for a good deed, and really it had been just because she was annoyed with Launcelot for not appreciating her help back in Morgan Le Fay's castle. Her cheeks flamed and she felt miserable. It was hot inside her helmet suddenly, and she dragged it off. Then she remembered too late she'd forgotten something else when she made her wish. She had wished to be in armor, and to be on horseback, and to be tall and strong, and to win, but she had forgotten to say anything about not being Katherine any longer. Now as the helmet came away, her long brown hair streamed down onto her shoulders, and her 9-year-old little girl face blinked at the astonished crowd. Those sitting nearest the ringside saw. Sir Mordred tittered. Sir Agravain sneered. The mean knights who were jealous of Sir Launcelot began to laugh, and mingled with the laughter were the cruel words, "Beaten by a girl." Some horrid little urchins took up the cry and made a rude song of it. "Lancelot's a churl, beaten by a girl." Sir Launcelot came to and sat up. He heard the laughter and he heard the song. He looked at Katherine. Katherine looked away, but not before he had recognized her. He got to his feet. There was silence all round the field. Even the mean knights stopped laughing. Sir Launcelot came over to Katherine. "Why have you done this to me?" he said. "I didn't mean to," said Katherine. She began to cry. With flushed cheeks but with head held high, Sir Launcelot strode to King Arthur's platform and knelt in the dust before it. In a low voice he asked leave to go on a far quest, a year's journey away at least, that he might hide his shame, till by 100 deeds of valor he would win back his lost honor and expunge the dread words, "beaten by a girl," forever. King Arthur did not trust himself to speak. He nodded his consent. Queen Guinevere did not even look at Sir Launcelot as he walked away from the field of tournament. Katherine went on crying. Merlin spoke a word in King Arthur's ear. King Arthur nodded. He rose, offered an arm to Guinevere, and led her from the stand. Merlin spoke another word, this time to the attendant knights. They began clearing the people from the field. Most of the people went quietly, but 3 children in the front row of the grandstand put up quite a fuss, saying that they had to find their sister Katherine, who'd done something terrible. But a sister was a sister, and they'd stick up for her anyway. The knights cleared them away with the rest. Presently, after what seemed like at least a year, Katherine found herself alone before Merlin. She was still crying. Merlin looked at her sternly. "Fie on your weeping," he said. "I wot well that ye be a false enchantress, come here in this guise to defeat our champion and discredit the Round Table." "I'm not. I didn't," said Katherine. "Ye be too," said Merlin, and you certainly have. After today our name is mud in Camelot." Oh, wept Katherine. "Silence, sorceress," said Merlin. He waved his wand at her. "I command that you appear before me in your true form." Immediately Katherine wasn't tall or strong or in armor any more, but just Katherine. Merlin looked surprised. "These fiends begin early," he said. "However, doubtless ye be but the instrument of a greater power." He waved his wand again. "I command that your allies, cohorts, aides, accomplices, and companions be brought hither to stand at your side." Jane and Mark and Martha appeared beside Katherine, looking nearly as unhappy and uncomfortable as she. Merlin looked really quite startled, then he shook his head sadly. "So young," he said, "yet so wicked." "We're not," said Martha, making a rude face. The behavior of the others was more seemly. "You see, sir," began Mark. "We didn't mean to," began Jane. "Let me," said Katherine. "I started it." In a rush of words and tears, she told Merlin everything, beginning with the charm, and her wish to travel back in time, and going on to what she had hoped to do, and what she'd done, and where she'd gone wrong. "I wanted to do a good deed," she said, "and I did one when I rescued Lancelot from that old dungeon. But then he wasn't properly grateful at all and made me undo it so he could rescue himself, all for the sake of his old honor. And that made me cross, and just now I pretended I was defeating him so the other knights wouldn't be so jealous of him. But really, I was just trying to get back at him for being so stuck up, and I always wanted to fight in a real tournament anyway." "Well, now you have," said Merlin. "And what good did you do by it?" "Just made everybody thoroughly unhappy." "I know," said Katherine. "That's what comes of meddling," said Merlin. "There is a pattern into history, and when you try to change that pattern, no good may follow." Katherine hung her head. "However," went on Merlin, and to the surprise of the 4 children he was smiling now, "all is not lost. I have a few magic tricks of my own, you know. Let me see, how shall I handle this? I could turn time back, I suppose, and make it as though this day had never happened, but it would take a lot out of me." "Really?" said Katherine in surprise. "It would be a mere nothing to us." Merlin looked at her a bit grimly. "Oh, it would it?" he said. "Oh, yes," said Katherine happily. "I could wish Lancelot were twice as near as here again, and I wish that he'd defeat me twice, and then I could wish that the people would honor him twice as much than they ever did, and then I could wish—" "Hold!" cried Merlin in alarm. "A truce to your wishes before you get us in worse trouble. I think I had best see this wonderful charm of yours." He made a pass at Katherine with his wand. "If there be any magic among you, let it appear now, or forever hold its peace." Katherine's hot hand, which for so long had clutched the charm, opened in spite of itself, and the charm lay in plain sight on her palm. Merlin looked at it. His eyes widened. He swept his tall hat from his head and bowed low before the charm 3 times. Then he turned to the children. "This is a very old and powerful magic," he said. "Older and more powerful than my own. It is in fact too powerful and too dangerous for 4 children, no matter how well they may intend to have in their keeping. I am afraid I must ask you to surrender it." He made another pass with his wand. The charm leaped gracefully from Katherine's hand to his own. Mark spoke. "But it came to us in our own time," he said. "And that's a part of history too, just as much as this is. Maybe we were meant to find it. Maybe there's some good thing we're supposed to do with it. There is a pattern to history, and when you try to change that pattern, no good may follow." Merlin looked at him. "You are a wise child," he said. Just average, said Mark modestly. Dear me, said Merlin. If that be so, if all children be as sensible as you in this far future time you dwell in. He broke off. What century did you say you come from? We didn't, said Mark, but it's the 20th. The 20th century, mused Merlin. What a happy age it must be, truly the golden age that we are told is to come. He stood thinking for a moment, then he smiled. Very well. Go back to your 20th century, he said, and take your magic with you, and do your best with it. But first, I have something to say. He held the charm at arm's length, rather as though he feared it might bite him, and addressed it with great respect. I wish, he said, that in 6 minutes it may be as though these children had never appeared here, except that they and I will remember, and I further wish that our tournament may begin all over again and proceed as originally planned by history, only twice as much so, he added, to be on the safe side. Now may I have it back, please? Katherine asked when it was done. In a minute, said Merlin. By the way, have you been making a lot of wishes lately? It feels rather worn out to me. It won't last forever, you know. Oh, dear, we were afraid of that, said Jane. How many more do we get? That would be telling, said Merlin, but you'd best not waste too many. It might be later than you think. Oh, cried Martha, maybe we'll never get home. Don't worry, said Merlin, smiling at her. There are still a few wishes left for you, and one more for me. Again he held the charm out before him. And I thirdly wish, he said, for the future protection of the world from the terrible good intentions of these children, for their protection against their own folly, that this charm, for twice the length of time it shall be in their hands, grant no further wishes, carrying said children out of their own century and country, but that they may find whatsoever boon the magic may have in store for them in their own time and place. He put the charm into Katherine's hand. And now you'd best be going, because in less than a minute, by my wish, it will be as though you'd never appeared here. And if you aren't home when that happens, goodness knows where you will be. But what about the good deed I wished, said Katherine. None of the ones I tried worked out. My child, said Merlin. His smile was very kind now. You have done your good deed. You have brought me word that for as far into time as the 20th century, the memory of Arthur and the Round Table, which I helped him to create, will be living yet. And in that far age, people will still care for the ideal I began, enough to come back through time and space to try to be of service to it. You have brought me that word, and now I can finish my work in peace, and know that I have done well. And if that's not a good deed, I should like to know what is. Now goodbye. Wish quickly. You have exactly 17 seconds. Katherine wished, and because their mother and Miss Bick had been worried yesterday by their being so long away, she put in that when they got home they should only have been gone 2 minutes by real time. This was really quite thoughtful of Katherine. Perhaps she too, like Mark the day before, had learned something during her day of adventure.